introduce Monica here, who's a future flamenco dancer. And I want to thank, actually, all of our PPA community participants who actually were here staging a protest, it sounded like, with all of their clapping. But I wanted to actually thank, in particular, Alba and Bob Tutnauer. Are they? Bill and Ann Griffin. Where are you guys? David and Aileen Tuberty, right there. And Bob and Mary Ciccarello. Where are you guys? Thank you so much. I also want to thank Katie and Dr. Dickerson for allowing us to go a little bit off the reservation with this presentation. And that was Yoshi on the cajon. So she's actually our leader for flamenco therapy. So thank you, Yoshi. And Cal Reichert in the back, also part of flamenco therapy. So thank you very much for helping us introduce this very interesting, fun topic, and for bringing Monica with us. If you want her back, she's up here at some point. You want me to okay. Sorry. So why do we focus on music? As many of you know, music actually makes us feel good, but it also is actually very helpful for stress reduction. I think probably everybody's had the experience of listening to a song and it actually lifts their spirits or changes their mood in some way. Music training, actually, if you look at the research studies, there's evidence that shows that people who have been trained early on in life show enhancement in certain types of thinking skills, with attention, memory, and it turns out there's some indication that early music training may actually help accommodate some of the challenges of normal aging. Well, it turns out that since our brains are actually plastic, malleable, moldable, we can learn over the course of the lifetime. We can actually use music as a tool for training in adulthood, and this can actually confer benefits, including improvements in attention, concentration, flexibility of our thinking, as well as training our motor skills, timing, anticipation, planning, all of these things. When you think about what's involved with not only listening to music, but maybe producing music, the way you all were with your clapping, right? You actually started to move in time with everybody else around you. And it didn't require much in the way of talking to one another. All of a sudden, you guys started to hear this rhythm going. and some of us like to sing in rhythm and in time. Very well done. But it was an amazing experience for me just to see how catchy it is. When you think about sit-ins and protests, right? Somebody starts chanting and everybody starts being pulled in. So this is a very powerful tool that doesn't require verbal communication. So what happens in the brain, we think, when we hear and produce music? Well, when you're producing music, you're engaging so many different parts of your brain. You're engaging motor abilities, your auditory abilities, your visual abilities if you're actually trying to follow music. You're looking at the instrument you're playing. There's a lot of timing and coordination. So it turns out that your brain lights up and starts connecting. And the more connections that you're making, the more you strengthen those connections. And there's some studies that even suggest that with a lot more of this musical training, you can actually start to see a growth in certain parts of the brain that, for example, the area that connects the left and right halves of the brain can actually start to show strengthening and growth in those areas. Ideally, what might happen is you'll hit one of these networks or these portions. So let's say we hit the motor area. Right there, let's say while you're actually producing music. And the hope is that you might actually trigger another connection somewhere along that network. Okay, so the more we can actually use music as a way to train and actually stimulate these networks, the hope is that you'll actually strengthen the connections. What is so special about music? Well, when you think about music, and there are a lot of components to music, there is rhythm, which you guys just produced. There's listening to pitch, changes in melody. Music, it turns out, in its very basic form, is part of all of our primitive older brains. Think about how we actually listen and are comforted by the human heart. We hear about children listening for the maternal heartbeat and how soothing that is to hear that regularity in that heartbeat. Sounds and voices. It turns out there's some suggestion that we may respond to higher pitched sounds because if you are a parent, that might actually signify something that's related to the stress in somebody else, right? So when we hear different pitches, different sounds, we respond to it in a particular way. The interesting thing about music is that there is an uncanny way it actually can create community. We just saw a little bit of that, okay? But I think you actually see that in other areas. When you think about people who are working on, let's say, if they're in boot camp, military training, right? When they're actually training in the morning at 5 a.m., how often it is that they start singing and marching in time. It's something that actually helps people stay on rhythm and move through activities that may be difficult for them. Think about what happens when you hear a national anthem, how moving that is for people, and it rouses people to come together as a community. So music has a way of actually naturally bringing people together. We also use music in very unusual ways, particularly when it comes to learning. How often is it that when you think back to being in school, learning rhymes, learning songs, trying to use that as a way to remember facts? And certainly the ancient Greeks would use this as a way of trying to remember lines and lines of poetry, text, stories. It's actually through some rhythmic process that actually helps them remember things and tag them a little bit differently. For me, the best way I can experience this is how easily I'm influenced by jingles, television jingles, right? So, for example, I'm constantly, and I'm a sucker when it comes to commercials, right? So I'll have some sort of jingle stuck in my head, and the next thing you know, I'm thinking about buying Oscar Mayer bologna, right? Does anybody remember that? Right? My bologna has a first name, it's Oscar, right? And goes on and on. So you get these tunes in your head, and it turns out music has a way of helping us remember things. And sometimes you actually have to sing through an entire song to find out what that next lyric is. So again, I find that music is an incredible tool. Unfortunately, it's a very hard to study tool because when you try to use it in some sort of research study, what is the comparison? How do you actually look at the actual impact of music and which aspects of music are actually helping us train our thinking in our brains? The nice thing about music is that we all have some way of producing it. Our bodies, our voices, these are our instruments. We take them wherever we go. So you don't need to carry around the big bass. You don't need to push around a piano. You can actually produce music in all its forms, either melodically or through rhythm and clapping, wherever you are. And it's an amazing way to actually engage people around you. You can go anywhere in the world, drop yourself down in a jazz club, and start tootling about on your saxophone, and people will start joining in, and you don't have to speak a word of the local language. So this is why I find music to be such a powerful tool. There's been a wealth of information coming out over the last few years looking at the impact of music on the brain. Every year there seems to be some new study looking at what does dance do to the brain as opposed to running, jogging, stretching. In 2014, a very powerful documentary was released called Alive Inside. I don't know if anybody's actually seen that. If you haven't, it's really worth a viewing. And the screens at the bottom there are two snapshots of an individual who was in a nursing home, fairly uncommunicative, and they looked at what happened when they gave patients their own iPods with their own playlists on it. And it was amazing to see that people lit up and started interacting in a way that they hadn't seen in some time, and hence the title, Alive Inside. Now we've actually seen, and this is actually serendipitous, last week there was a study that was just released looking at the comparison between what happens in the brain when you either walk, stretch, or dance. And it turns out having any activity, especially if you were sedentary before, can actually result in, if you've gone through some sort of activity and being active again, improvements in thinking skills. But the dancers, it turns out, ended up showing a change in the white matter, those parts of the brain that connect the cells and help with transmission of messages along the brain cells. That actually increased in the brains of people who danced. Now there's some speculation as to why that is. When you're dancing, you have to engage motor skills. you have to keep in time, you have to anticipate what the next moves are, and you have to do a lot of coordination and multitasking, right? So that may be one reason why that led to this increase in the white matter. Now, that didn't necessarily translate to improvements in cognitive skill, but they're hoping that if they follow these patients over time in these same interventions, they'll actually be able to see something like that. So there's a lot going on out there looking at the integration of music and movement and what it can do for the human brain. So as I mentioned, there are a lot of benefits to rhythmic movement, or as most people call it, dancing, but it's dancing in time. And not only does movement and in time actually help strengthen those connections, you can also see that music brings back memories for a lot of people. It's also, in my mind, again, another form of communication that does not require words. And this is where I found it to be most powerful, especially in our PPA FTD community. Because as we know, communication, this is the way we interact with the world. And when you start to lose that, it's an incredibly frustrating experience. How do we actually find an alternative, another way to communicate? And it turns out music, movement, gesturing, hearing songs, singing them can actually help us engage in ways where you don't really actually need the verbal communication, the verbal word. I just want to give you a sense of what movement therapies might look like. This is, you may recognize her, that's Yoshi. And we recently had an excursion out to Valley Farms where some of the people in our FTD community actually reside. And I just thought it would be nice to see how, for a lot of these patients, this was an interesting activity. First of all, it was quite unusual to see this very colorfully dressed woman come in and clapping and playing this exotic music. But I think it's actually quite powerful to see how she doesn't really need to say much or do anything. She teaches them some simple movements and plays certain musics, and she can get everybody involved. We didn't plug in the, that's okay. There's a lot of very interesting music going on in the background. Okay. And you know, it's amazing because for a lot of these patients, what we heard afterwards is that typically it's very hard for them to actually sit still for, you know, more than 15, 20-minute programs. I think we ended up staying there for almost 45 minutes to an hour, and they were really quite engaged. Another video at Hebrew Senior Life, and some of the exercises that the flamenco therapists were teaching the residents there. Different types of arm movements, moving in time. It is actually quite striking to see for a lot of these patients, again, they really are not very active most of the day. It's unfortunate because a lot of places, they just don't have the human resources to tend to all of the patients in a facility. And so they're pretty sedentary, they're left idle, but then the minute you start playing music and actually engaging them, you can start to have them active, physically moving around, getting that blood circulating, and giving that mental stimulation they're just probably not used to. So let's try a few exercises just to get our own blood moving. What we usually do in these PPA groups, and for those of you who have gone through this and were my guinea pigs, I will rely on you to help out. What we try to do is identify how do you just find the beat? And we can find the beat in a number of different ways. It's usually the bass, it's the pulse. You find beat in music, but you also find beat in poetry, nursery rhymes. So what I'm going to do right now is clap something out. And I want you to see if you can pick up not only the beat, but maybe you can actually pick out what the nursery rhyme is that I'm clapping, okay? So what I'm going to clap right now is actually the rhythm and what the words might be, okay? Ready? What was that? Row, row, row your boat. Isn't that amazing? I didn't have to say anything, okay? And so that is, again, the power of being able to hear. When we speak, we actually speak with a bit of rhythm, melody, changes in the rhythm and the melody. And that's what we're actually distilling out when we're doing these exercises. So what I might end up doing is having part of the group actually clap the beat. So in this situation would be row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream. Okay? So let's see if you guys can actually just do the beat with me. Okay? Ready? Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream. Perfect. Okay. Now let's try to integrate the words and the beat. Okay? Let's try doing the words. When I say go, just start clapping. Each clap is for each syllable of the words. Okay? Ready? Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Beautiful. Now I'm going to split the group up. Okay? So this is going to be hard. So definitely the tables on that side is one group. This is another. You guys in the middle decide amongst yourselves who wants to be on the left and who wants to be on the right, okay? So what I usually would do in a group is when we start off and trying to figure out, can we actually distinguish beat from rhythm? We'll have half the group keeping the beat while the other half claps the rhythm. So let's say the left half, you guys are going to do beat. The right half, you're going to do rhythm. Okay? Ready? And beautiful. Okay. So we'll go through one round and you'll get confident. And then I'll say, all right, once you've gone through it once, everybody has to switch their roles. Okay? So let's give it a shot. So we'll do it again. Beat, rhythm. Once we've gone through the entire rhyme once, we'll start again, but everybody's going to switch. So you guys will do the beat, you guys will do the rhythm. All right? So we'll start with your original roles, and then once we get through it once, everybody switches. Ready? And okay, there was a little bit of confusion there. What happened? It required you to say, oh my goodness, we're about to come to a new beginning. What am I supposed to be doing? I have to switch. So there's a lot of focus, a lot of concentration, and then a lot of flexibility in your thinking and your movements, okay? So you can imagine how difficult that can be in time. Now, if I stopped after one iteration and then we said, okay, now everybody think about what you're doing and switch, that would have been a little easier, but I had to do it continuously. Right? And that's the beauty of working with music. There's something about the anticipation, the planning, while also focusing on what you're doing. Now, in other groups, I might actually do rounds. Do you remember doing this in camp, where you'd all split up and you'd start with row, row, row your boat, row, row, row your boat, row, row, row your boat, and see how well you can actually do that. Now that we have 3 rows, let's give it a shot. So we're going to start here on my left. They're going to go through row, row, row your boat, and then keep going. After they finish that first line, you guys come in with row, row, row your boat. After they finish their first line, you will come in. Meanwhile, everybody just continues what you're doing. Okay? Are we ready? We're going to all do the rhythm. We're all doing the rhythm, but we're starting at different times. Okay? So group 1, group 2, group 3. Ready? Group 1. Okay. All right. How did that feel? Okay, it's a little bit. So what was required there? You had to pay attention to what you were doing, ignore to some extent what the others were doing, but you still had to keep track so that you weren't going fast or slow, or everybody's staying on the same beat. So as you can see, you can play around with music, play around with familiar tunes, but do a lot of these activities that really stress the system a little bit, okay? And this is one way that we start in the group, and then we do it with a lot of familiar songs. This one we're not going to get into because I think that might cause a little bit of I'm not sure what. But if you want to put yourself through that, we're going to do that during the workshop this afternoon, okay? And essentially what I do here is sort of going back to the flamenco therapy and flamenco rhythms. I find flamenco rhythms quite unusual because they're not a regular beat. There's something about these rhythms, and they can actually, if you look at the flamenco therapy table out there, there's a little bit of an explanation, but they actually create these different sounds, they call them palos, which are different styles of music, using a 12-count clock. And they can actually generate up to 50 different styles of music. So what I try to do is play on that a little bit, where I'll ask the group to clap where the red dots are as we count through a clock, okay? And they have to accent and clap on the accents, and only on the accents, okay? And I'll introduce different rhythms. Here, they'll hear the clock ticking, 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way through 12. And then they have to clap only when I get to the 12, the 4, and the 8. So it's a very regular rhythm. So once they get used to that and they get confident, then I try to switch it up. Here, I'll say, well, now we have to clap a different rhythm. Now we have to count at, somebody want to tell me? 12, 3, 7, 8, and 10. Not a very typical rhythm, okay? And so people actually have to keep track in the clock, but only count at 12, 3, 7, and 8, okay? Then they have to accent at 1 and 2, 4 and 5, 7 and 8, 10 and 11, okay? And then once everybody has that rhythm, we say now we want one group to do one rhythm, another group to do that funny asymmetric rhythm, okay? And the one that has just the 3 accents. And it's like an orchestra. And then as we get more complicated, once you get comfortable with it again, then I have everybody switch. So it requires you to really do a mental shift and not do what you had just learned to do. What's amazing to me is that you can take a group of people who have no music background, introduce these rhythms, and with enough iteration, you actually can get them to learn these new patterns and then switch. It's the miracle of plasticity. We're still able to, as adults, learn and change and adapt with a little bit of instruction, a little bit of intensity, okay, motivation. Other activities require that you actually stomp the bass while you actually clap. Okay, and that's not as easy as you would think. Sometimes I'll say you actually use your foot just to keep the bass while you clap the lyrics to I've Been Working on the Railroad. Okay, that's a little bit tricky. And then we'll do the same thing. We give these exercises for people to go home and train with, practice with. You can practice with somebody else. Have your partner keep the bass for you while you do the accenting. Okay. Another fun thing that we do in this group, gesturing, right? We don't just communicate with words, we communicate with our body language. When I first met the PPA group, we went through an exercise where I said, I'd like for you to not only clap what your name is, but then pantomime some activity, action that describes who you are. So I had people who were bird watchers, I had people who were artists, people who were musicians, all right? And so they were able to act out all of these activities that they felt identified them. And that actually helped everybody else learn one another's names and helped learn who the other person is in a different way. Again, no words were required. Then we had people try to communicate while they were developing their own sign language, essentially. So I had people envision, so what can you do with your arms? Make believe they're like paintbrushes, okay? Can you actually make movements like that? The famous one that people like to use in the flamenco world is you're picking an apple and eating an apple. Picking an apple and eating an apple. Looks kind of interesting. But we're actually creating different types of movements in that way so that we can then have them use those movements in time with music. So here we have our PPA group, our very brave PPA group. Is that okay? I think some of the group members are just seeing this for the first time, so surprise.
This works too.
Oh, really?
Forward,
Okay.
backward.
Okay. All right. No? So there they are, picking their apples and eating them. Very nice. Another thing that I like to do are mirroring exercises. Now, these are a lot of fun. Has anybody done this before? So what happens is you face one another. Somebody's designated the leader, the other's the follower, and then you switch. But essentially, you can't really anticipate what the other person's doing. You just have to act like you're their mirror. So if they start moving their arm this way, you have to move your arm on that side in the same way, as quickly as you can and in time with the music. Okay? And this was a really nice activity because, as one of our group members mentioned, he said, you know, this is something where you can't tell who's a caregiver and who's a patient anymore. Right? You level the playing field, and it's actually quite a release for some people because it feels as though they're actually learning and being engaged in this activity together. Some examples here. A lot of apple picking. Really complicated hand movements there. A lot of apple eating. After a while, we had people stand up. And so they're actually mirroring movements, not just with their arms, but also their legs. So they're standing to the side, they're moving their arms. There's Katie, sort of getting into it as well. It's a contagious thing. And for some people, they just sort of get into it. And actually, we have a little bit of doing their own thing going off on off the reservation there too. Okay, so the moment really captured, and they ended up just really having a good time. So, you know, whether or not this actually has long-lasting benefits and can affect change that lasts in the brain, it's really hard to tell. Certainly, it feels as though it's a nice activity for couples, groups. It's a stress reliever. People enjoy themselves. And I think when it comes to this idea of brain training and these activities, can they actually make a change in the brain? It's something that needs to be studied. You know, hopefully that it will get to the point where we can actually get funding for studies like this. But the idea is, can you actually create some sort of regimen where you're practicing these activities for a certain amount of time every day for a number of minutes, 5 days out of 7 days of the week, and over time, do you notice any changes? I'd like to think there is, but I think we need to study it. So I don't want to be misleading in saying that this is definitely going to cure any brain problems or actually help change things in an appreciable way. But certainly, the nice thing about this type of activity is that generally there is no side effect, okay, other than embarrassment for some of us. So I'll tell people, you can go home and try these activities, find the beat, find the rhythm in your favorite song. One of the activities that we did in our group was we actually pulled in some songs that weren't flamenco songs that were familiar. And so we had some Ella Fitzgerald, we had some Frank Sinatra, people were familiar with those, and they were actually able to come up with pantomiming and gesturing and acting out certain parts of the song, which was really a lot of fun. I wish I could actually show you that. But I also have people play around with the volume of their clapping. You can actually change that to a loud, to a soft, a deeper sound, and a higher sound. Right? So there are very many different ways you can actually play around with sound. And again, all of this is about clapping and movement and listening to music. What's the bottom line? Rhythm and music and movement exercises are not language dependent, at least not verbal. Music, I think, is a language in and of itself. Basics of beat and rhythm, we all have that to varying degrees. We contain that in ourselves. We have a heartbeat that we can follow, okay? So these are things that are very much part of our ancient brains that will be there for a very long time and will respond to music. It connects us emotionally, and there are activities that level the playing field. If I were to show people some of those mirroring exercises, a lot of people would say, I can't tell actually who's the patient and who's the caregiver in this situation. And that's the nice thing about this type of activity. It's new for everyone and they enjoy it. And you get a sense for what it's like, as one of our group members said, what it's like to not necessarily be the caregiver and having to make all the decisions all the time. Physical activity, in addition to the cognitive stimulation and training, I think it depends on how the activity is practiced, but we think that having the physical activity on top of the musical piece, it's sort of get more bang for your buck. All right, physical activity is helpful for your brain as it is. Why not move with music? I think it actually can be a lot more enjoyable, although I never could understand step aerobics. That was something I could never really, it's with music, but I ended up throwing out a cervical disc when I did that, so be careful. And I'm sorry, this is a little dark, but this is our group, and I wanted to acknowledge them again. Thank you so much for putting up with this and really supporting this activity. So I'm hoping that we'll continue to move into the afternoon, but I think it's time to move and get food. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. We just have one more thing to do before lunch. I just find it really powerful to not only think about how music and movement can bring enjoyment to our lives and connect people, but also some of the studies that are going on now to try to see if it might actually evoke brain plasticity, change inflammation, or do things that might actually interact with some of the mechanisms that Dr. McGinnis was telling us about in the final common pathways of neurodegeneration. So really powerful stuff and areas that we are very much pursuing right now. So I think Bonnie and Katie are going to close the morning session with the raffle drawing.
So what do you want to say what the raffle is to inspire?
So as some of you saw, flamenco therapy has really powerful mission, really, and they've been working over the last year going into nursing facilities. Yoshi has actually very kindly offered to provide a performance to the raffle winner. She's a phenomenal dancer, for those of you who saw her at the gala, but she's very generously offered to do a performance to our raffle winners today. So, without further ado, ticket number 509652. Again, that's 509652. And Katie pointed out that one way in which you can actually make use of this is to donate the performance to a particular facility that you have in mind. So, any takers? If not, I will have her come to my house to perform.
We might have to pull a second.
We might have to pull a second. Okay, one more time. 509652. No? All right. Runner up. 509590. Anyone? Anybody? Anybody? 509590. Wave. Sorry, I didn't see who it was. Okay, so you are the recipient of a phenomenal flamenco performance by Yoshi, and so we'll talk afterwards just to give you all the information. So thank you.
So everyone grab lunch. There's food outside, and bring it back in and eat. And Katie's going to start her presentation at about 1:15. Thank you very much.